With a sickening thud, the deadbolts slid into place as the heavy titanium door slammed shut. Convinced she was the traitor who had sold him out, the ruthless syndicate boss locked her out in the dark. It wasn't until a torn, blood-soaked piece of paper slid beneath the door frame that he finally realized he had just condemned the only woman who ever truly loved him. The rain in Boston always smelled like rust and salt, but tonight, inside the basement clinic off Hanover Street, the dominant scent was copper. Beatrice Hayes stood over the stainless steel table, her gloved hands pressing a combat hemostatic gauze into the shoulder of a screaming man. Beatrice, bare to the very few people she trusted, was not supposed to be here. 3 years ago, she was a top trauma nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital. She had a 401k, a spotless Honda Civic, and a life perfectly insulated from the city's criminal underbelly. But when her younger brother, Daniel, racked up a massive gambling debt at the Encore Boston Harbor, money owed directly to the Lombardi Syndicate, Bea's pristine life evaporated. To keep Daniel breathing, she traded her hospital scrubs for a burner phone and a black medical bag, patching up bullet holes and knife wounds the police were never allowed to see. At 2:14 a.m., the reinforced steel door of her underground clinic nearly blew off its hinges. 3 men in tailored Brioni suits burst in, their faces pale, their clothes ruined by rain and arterial spray. But it was the man they were carrying that made Bea's blood run cold. Dominic Rossi. Even in the civilian world, everyone knew the name. He was the 32-year-old heir to the Rossi family, a man who had violently consolidated the New England ports over the last 5 years. He was terrifying, notoriously cold, and currently bleeding to death on her linoleum floor. "Clear the table," shouted his lieutenant, a massive wall of a man named Carmine. He shoved Bea aside with enough force to bruise her ribs, dumping Dominic onto the steel surface. "Don't touch me like that in my own clinic," Bea snapped, recovering her footing. The men raised their Sig Sauer handguns, but a weak, gravelly voice stopped them. "Put the guns down." Dominic coughed, a thin line of blood spilling over his chiseled jaw. His dark eyes, usually described by the press as dead and calculating, locked onto Bear. "Fix me." Bea didn't hesitate. She grabbed trauma shears, cutting away the ruined $3,000 suit jacket. The entry wound was just below the right clavicle, dangerously close to the subclavian artery. "He needs a hospital," Bea said, her hands already flying as she applied pressure. "I don't have the blood volume for a transfusion if that artery is severed." "No hospitals," Carmine growled, pressing the barrel of his gun against the base of Bea's skull. "You fix him here, or you die here." "Carmine," Dominic gasped, his breathing shallow. "Back off. Let her work." For the next 2 hours, the basement was a tense, silent theater of survival. Bear clamped the bleed, meticulously navigating the damage to the surrounding tissue. She worked with a calm precision that seemed to fascinate Dominic, even as he floated in and out of consciousness on a heavy dose of stolen medical-grade fentanyl. He watched her face, the determined set of her jaw, a stray lock of auburn hair falling across her forehead. She wasn't trembling like the others who looked at him. She was annoyed. When she finally threw the last blood-soaked sponge into the biohazard bin and began suturing the wound, Dominic spoke again, his voice much steadier. "You're Beatrice Hayes." Bea froze, her needle hovering over his skin. "I'm the woman saving your life. Don't make me regret it. Your brother owes my uncle $150 grand, Dominic continued, ignoring her warning. He winced as she pulled a stitch tight. "You've been paying it off in blood money. 10 grand a month, patching up low-level dealers." "Your point, Mr. Rossi?" she asked coldly, snipping the thread. "My point," Dominic said, slowly pushing himself up on his left elbow, the muscles in his chest straining, "is that you don't work for my uncle anymore. You work for me. I'm not a permanent fixture for the mob. Once Daniel's debt is paid, I'm out." Dominic let out a dark, breathless chuckle. "There is no out, Beatrice. You just proved you can handle a bullet to a boss without shaking. Tomorrow morning, a black Mercedes G-Wagon is going to pick you up. You're moving into my estate in Weston. You will be my personal physician. In exchange, Daniel's debt is erased." "I don't want to live with you," she fired back, stripping off her bloody gloves. "I have a life." Carmine stepped forward, but Dominic held up a hand. "You have a choice," Dominic said, his eyes turning to ice. "You move into the estate, and your brother breathes free air. You say no, and I let Carmine take a ride to Daniel's apartment in Somerville. What time does his shift at the bakery start? 5:30? Bee's heart slammed against her ribs. She stared into Dominic Rossi's eyes and saw exactly why he ruled the city. He wasn't just a killer. He was a master chess player who knew everyone's leverage. "Fine," Bee whispered, her voice laced with venom. "But you stay out of my way, and I stay out of yours." Dominic's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. "We'll see, Nurse Hayes. We'll see." The Rossi estate in Weston, Massachusetts, was less of a home and more of a fortress disguised as a billionaire's architectural fever dream. Surrounded by 10-foot iron walls, state-of-the-art thermal cameras, and armed guards patrolling the 50-acre woods, it was completely isolated from the world. For the first 3 months, Bea was treated like a high-value prisoner. She was given a luxurious suite in the East Wing, overlooking the manicured gardens, but she couldn't leave the grounds without an escort. Her days were spent checking Dominic's vitals, changing his dressings, and managing the physical therapy required to get the mobility back in his right arm. The proximity bred a dangerous, crackling tension between them. Dominic was not the loud, boisterous mafia caricature depicted in movies. He was quiet, calculating, and obsessed with classical history, often reading Marcus Aurelius in his sprawling mahogany library. He didn't drink, he didn't entertain escorts, and he spent hours watching Bee. "You're glaring at me again," Bee said one evening, aggressively massaging a knot of scar tissue on his shoulder. They were in his study, the fire crackling in the hearth, fighting the bitter chill of a New England November. "I'm observing," Dominic corrected smoothly. He didn't flinch despite the pain she was deliberately inflicting. "You read a lot of medical journals, yet you prefer to listen to late 90s alternative rock while you work. It's a contradictory profile." "I'm a contradictory person," she replied, pressing harder. "Does it hurt?" "Yes." "Good." Suddenly, Dominic's left hand shot out, wrapping around her wrist. The movement was so fast, Bea gasped. He didn't squeeze hard enough to hurt her, but the sheer strength of his grip was a stark reminder of who he was. He pulled her slightly closer, his dark eyes trailing down her neck to her collarbone. "Why do you hate me so much, Beatrice?" he murmured, his voice dropping an octave. "You kidnapped me," she whispered back, refusing to look away, though her pulse was hammering against his thumb. "I gave you a sanctuary," he countered softly. "Your brother is free. You have an unlimited budget for your medical research. I haven't let anyone touch you. In my world, that's not kidnapping. That's protection." Before she could reply, the heavy oak doors of the study burst open. Carmine walked in, looking more rattled than Bea had ever seen him. Dominic immediately dropped her wrist, the romantic tension shattering like glass. "Boss," Carmine said, eyeing Bea with open hostility. "We have a problem. The O'Rourke family just hit 2 of our shipments at the seaport, and they knew the exact patrol schedules. We have a rat." The temperature in the room plummeted. Dominic's expression shifted from the man who had just stared at Bea's lips back to the sociopathic head of the Rossi family. "Who?" "We're still pulling the server logs, but whoever it is, they're communicating from inside this house." Carmine glared pointedly at Bea. "Get out," Dominic ordered Carmine. "Find the leak. If you have to tear the walls down, do it." Over the next week, the estate descended into paranoia. The O'Rourkes, a rival Irish syndicate from South Boston, were making aggressive, highly targeted moves against Rossi territories. They knew things only Dominic's inner circle could know. The tension in the house was suffocating. Guards were doubled. Phones were confiscated, and Bea felt the icy sting of Dominic's sudden withdrawal. He stopped coming to the library. He had his physical therapy sessions with the door open, and Carmine standing guard. Then came the night of the siege. It was a Tuesday in December. A blizzard was dumping feet of snow onto Massachusetts, grounding all helicopters and slowing police response times to a crawl. Bea was in the kitchen brewing tea when the first explosion rocked the estate. The front gates had been blown open by an armored truck. Gunfire erupted, the deafening rhythmic staccato of automatic weapons echoing through the massive halls of the mansion. "They're inside the perimeter," a guard yelled over his radio before a spray of bullets shattered the floor-to-ceiling kitchen windows. Bea screamed, diving behind the marble island as glass rained down on her. Suddenly, strong hands grabbed her arms, yanking her up. It was Dominic. He was in a black tactical sweater, holding a rifle, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "Move!" he roared over the gunfire. He dragged her through the servants' corridors toward the basement, where a titanium-reinforced panic room was built to withstand a military assault. Carmine and 2 other loyal guards were already there, holding the perimeter. "Boss, we have to lock it down," Carmine yelled, returning fire down the hallway. "They have 30 men. We're outgunned until the backup arrives." Dominic pulled Bea toward the heavy steel door of the safe room, but just as they reached the threshold, Carmine shoved a manila folder into Dominic's chest. "Look at it!" Carmine screamed over the noise. "I found it in her room. The IT guys traced the outgoing encrypted messages. They pinged off her laptop, boss. She's the rat." Dominic froze. He ripped open the folder. Inside were printed bank statements, a wire transfer of $500,000 to an offshore account in the name of Daniel Hayes, authorized by an O'Rourke front company. Alongside it were IP logs matching Bea's personal laptop. Bea stared at the papers, her mind spinning in horror. No, Dominic, I swear to God, I don't even know how to use encryption software. Carmine planted that." Dominic looked at the papers, then looked at Bea. For a fraction of a second, she saw something shatter behind his eyes. It was betrayal. Deep, agonizing betrayal. "Boss, they're coming!" Carmine yelled, a bullet ricocheting off the doorframe inches from his head. "If she comes in, we're compromised." Dominic's jaw tightened. He looked at Bea, his expression turning entirely to stone. He stepped backward into the safe room. "Dominic, please!" Bea screamed, tears streaming down her face as she reached out for him. "It's a setup! I love you. I wouldn't do this." He didn't say a word. He just stared at her with dead eyes, reached out and slammed the heavy titanium door in her face. The deadbolts slammed into place with a sickening thud. She was locked out, alone in the corridor. Seconds later, the O'Rourke hit squad rounded the corner. Bea turned to run, but a deafening crack echoed in the narrow hallway. White-hot agony exploded in her abdomen. She collapsed to the cold tile floor, clutching her stomach as blood poured through her fingers, staining her white sweater crimson. The hitmen ran past her, ignoring the dying woman, to focus on blowing the safe room door. They attached thermite charges to the hinges, completely ignoring Bear as she dragged her bleeding body toward the titanium barrier. Her vision was going black at the edges. She knew exactly what a gut wound meant. She had 20 minutes before hemorrhagic shock stopped her heart. With trembling, blood-soaked hands, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the only thing she had. A Rossi family stationery card she had used as a bookmark and a pen. But the pen was broken, crushed when she fell. Coughing, Bea dipped her index finger into the pooling blood on her stomach. Her hand shook violently as she wrote on the back of the card. When she was finished, she used the last ounce of her strength to slide the bloody card under the tiny millimeter gap at the bottom of the titanium door. Then, Beatrice Hayes closed her eyes, and the world went dark. Inside the titanium-reinforced panic room, the air was dead and heavy, smelling faintly of ozone and the terrified sweat of the guards. Outside, the muffled, rhythmic thud of thermite charges being adhered to the door echoed like a ticking clock. Dominic Rossi stood frozen in the center of the room. His hands, which had ended dozens of lives without a tremor, were shaking. He stared at the heavy steel door. He had just condemned Beatrice to death. He had looked into the eyes of the only woman who had ever dared to challenge him, the only woman who had seen the man beneath the monster, and he had locked her in the dark with a squad of heavily armed butchers. "Good call, boss," Carmine breathed heavily, wiping sweat from his forehead as he checked the magazine of his Glock. "She had us all fooled. The O'Rourkes played a long game using her brother's debt. We'll wait for the perimeter backup. When Arthur's crew gets here, we pinch them in the hallway." Dominic didn't answer. The printed IP logs and bank statements felt like lead in his hands. He stared at the paper, his mind struggling to reconcile the Beatrice he knew, the woman who meticulously categorized her medical supplies and listened to the cranberries while suturing bullet wounds, with the profile of a criminal mastermind. Then a flicker of movement caught his eye, at the base of the safe room door, where a gap no thicker than a few coins allowed for air circulation in the event of ventilation failure. Something white slipped across the threshold. Dominic walked slowly toward the door. Karma and the remaining guard, a young kid named Leo, kept their weapons trained on the hinges, anticipating the breach. Dominic knelt. It was a piece of his own heavy stock stationery. The edges were smeared with something dark and wet. He flipped it over. The handwriting was erratic, jagged, and written in thick, drying blood. But the words were legible. They were not a desperate plea for her life. They were a nurse's clinical observation. Carmine's IP logs say the transfer was at 8 and 12 p.m. tonight. I was in the library with you from 7 to 8 to 9-0. You know this. Look at Carmine's left wrist. He took his Rolex off. The O'Rourke Syndicate tattoo is burning his skin from laser removal. The air in Dominic's lungs vanished. 8:00 p.m. Beatrice had been sitting across from him in the library, her hands digging into the scar tissue of his shoulder. She hadn't been near her laptop, but Carmine had been tasked with sweeping the East Wing for security bugs. Carmine had access to her room. Dominic stood up slowly. The sociopathic calm that made him the most feared man in New England descended over him like a shroud of winter ice. He turned to his lieutenant. "Carmine," Dominic said, his voice terrifyingly soft. "Yeah, boss? We got about 2 minutes before those charges blow," Carmine said, keeping his eyes on the door. "Take off your jacket. Roll up your left sleeve." Carmine froze. The ambient noise of the drill outside seemed to fade into a vacuum. He turned his head, his eyes darting from Dominic to the bloody card in Dominic's left hand. "Boss, what are you talking about? We're in the middle of a siege. Roll up the sleeve, Carmine, or I will tear your arm off and do it for you," Dominic ordered. Carmine's hand twitched toward his holstered weapon. It was a micro-expression, a fatal tell. But Dominic was faster. In one fluid motion, Dominic raised his rifle and fired a single round into Carmine's right kneecap. Carmine roared in agony, collapsing to the floor. Leo, the young guard, jumped back in shock, raising his weapon uncertainly. "Stand down, Leo," Dominic barked. He walked over to the writhing Carmine, grabbed the man's left wrist, and ripped the tailored sleeve of his Brioni shirt open. There, wrapped in fresh medical gauze, was a raw, weeping burn wound, the exact shape of the Celtic cross favored by Finnick O'Rourke's inner circle. Carmine had been trying to erase his past, playing double agent to usurp Dominic's throne. "She was innocent," Dominic whispered, the realization ripping through his chest like a serrated blade. "You framed her. You let them in." "Dominic, wait!" Carmine choked out, blood bubbling on his lips. Dominic didn't wait. He drew his sidearm and put a bullet between Carmine's eyes. "Leo," Dominic commanded, turning to the keypad on the wall. "Override the lockdown." "Boss, the O'Rourkes are right outside that door. They have thermite." "Open the damn door!" Dominic roared, his composure finally shattering. The heavy deadbolts clicked. Before the hydraulic system could even fully retract, Dominic kicked the titanium door open. The O'Rourke hit squad, preparing to detonate the charges, looked up in shock. They expected the Rossi boss to cower inside until backup arrived. They did not expect a man possessed by the devil himself. Dominic opened fire. He moved with a lethal, mechanical precision, dropping 3 men in the corridor before they could even raise their weapons. The hallway became a deafening, chaotic storm of muzzle flashes and shattered marble. Dominic took a grazing round to his hip, but the adrenaline and pure, unadulterated terror for Beatrice masked the pain. When the hallway was clear, the heavy silence returned, broken only by the sound of Dominic's frantic breathing. He dropped his weapon and ran down the corridor. He found her near the kitchen archway. Beatrice was slumped against the wall, her skin ashen and translucent, resembling cracked porcelain. A massive pool of blood had spread across the white marble floor, painting her sweater a horrific crimson. "B," Dominic choked out, dropping to his knees. He slid his hands under her, his fingers slipping on the slick, metallic-smelling blood. "Beatrice, look at me. Open your eyes." Her eyelashes fluttered. Her breathing was a shallow, wet rattle. "You locked me out," she whispered, a tear slipping down her pale cheek. "I know. I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry," he pleaded, pressing his hands desperately against the wound in her abdomen to stem the bleeding. "Stay with me. You don't get to die on me, Beatrice. That is an order." Her lips curved into a faint, tragic smile. "I don't take orders from the mob." Her eyes rolled back, and her head fell against his chest. The blizzard outside was a blinding wall of white, but Dominic drove the bullet-riddled G-Wagon like a madman. He bypassed Mass General. Too many questions, too much protocol, and drove straight to a private underground surgical suite in the Back Bay, run by Dr. Alistair Montgomery, an ex-military surgeon on the Rossi payroll. For 7 hours, Dominic sat in the sterile, fluorescent-lit waiting room, covered in Beatrice's blood. His underboss, Arthur, arrived with a dozen men to secure the building, but Dominic didn't speak to them. He simply stared at his blood-stained hands, the image of Bee's broken body looping endlessly in his mind. When Dr. Montgomery finally emerged, he looked exhausted. "She flatlined twice on the table, Dominic," the surgeon said softly. "The bullet missed her descending aorta by a millimeter, but it shredded her intestines. I had to resect a significant portion. She's in a medically induced coma. If she doesn't develop sepsis in the next 48 hours, she might make it. But it's entirely up to her." Dominic nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Over the next week, the criminal underworld of Boston was bathed in blood. While Beatrice slept in the sterile quiet of the private ICU, Dominic Rossi waged a war of annihilation. The O'Rourke family was decimated, warehouses were burned to the ground, supply lines were severed. Finally, Finnick O'Rourke was found in a shipping container at the harbor. Dominic handled him personally. It wasn't about business anymore. It was about vengeance. But when the smoke cleared and Dominic stood atop the undisputed throne of the city's underworld, he felt nothing but hollow ash. The empire meant nothing if the woman he loved was lying in a hospital bed because of his failure to trust her. On the 9th day, Beatrice opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was the sterile ceiling. The second was Dominic. He was sitting in a plastic chair beside her bed. He looked 10 years older. He hadn't shaved, his eyes were sunken, and he was wearing a simple black t-shirt instead of his armor-like tailored suits. "You're awake," he whispered, standing up slowly, as if afraid any sudden movement might break her. Bee tried to speak, but her throat was sandpaper. Dominic gently lifted a plastic cup, guiding a straw to her lips. The cool water felt like a miracle. "Where am I?" she rasped. "A secure facility," Dominic answered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're safe. The O'Rourkes are gone. Carmine is dead. It's over." Bee closed her eyes, the memories of the siege rushing back in a horrific flood. The gunfire, the betrayal, the heavy thud of the titanium door locking her out in the cold corridor. She turned her head away from him. "Go away." Dominic flinched, as if she had shot him. "Beatrice, please. I read the note. You saved my life. You saved the whole family." "I was blind." "You looked at me," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of trauma and deep, simmering rage. "You looked me in the eyes, and you believed a piece of paper over me. You locked me out to die, Dominic. It was the biggest mistake of my life, he said, stepping closer, his voice breaking. This terrifying mafia boss, a man who commanded legions, was weeping. I let my paranoia destroy the only pure thing I ever had. I will spend the rest of my life making it up to you. I don't want your life, Bea spat, fighting through the agonizing pain in her stomach. I want my life back. I want to go back to my hospital. I want to be a nurse. I want nothing to do with your violent, miserable world. Dominic went completely still. He stared at her for a long time, absorbing the hatred in her eyes. He nodded slowly. Okay, he said quietly. He reached into his jacket pocket, but instead of a weapon or a stack of dirty cash, he pulled out a thick, legal manila envelope. He placed it gently on the foot of her bed. "What is that?" she asked, eyeing it warily. "My next order," Dominic said, stepping back from the bed. "Arthur is taking over the syndicate. He's liquidating the illegal assets. I'm stepping down. I am officially a legitimate civilian." Bea stared at him in shock. "Shock? You can't just step down from the mob." "I just did," Dominic replied smoothly, a hint of his old confidence returning. "Those papers are the deeds to St. Jude's Memorial Hospital in South Boston. The board was going bankrupt. I bought the entire hospital through a clean holding company. It's in your name, Beatrice. You aren't just a nurse anymore. You're the chief of medicine. You're the owner." Bea was speechless. She looked from the envelope to the man standing before her. "I can't undo locking that door," Dominic said, his dark eyes locking onto hers, pleading for a fraction of grace. "But I can spend the rest of my days making sure no doors are ever closed to you again. Take the hospital, Beatrice. Run it your way. If you never want to see me again, say the word, and I will walk out of this room and vanish." The silence in the room was deafening. The heart monitor beeped in a steady, reassuring rhythm. Bea looked at the man who had kidnapped her, the man who had nearly gotten her killed, and the man who had just burned his entire empire to the ground to buy her a sanctuary. She slowly reached down and pulled the heavy envelope into her lap. "I'm going to need a lot of funding for the pediatric ward," Bea said softly, her eyes welling with tears. Dominic let out a breath. He looked like he had been holding for 9 days. A small, genuine smile broke across his exhausted face. "Whatever you need, Nurse Hayes. Whatever you need." What a harrowing journey of betrayal, survival, and ultimate redemption. Dominic's transformation from a ruthless boss to a man willing to sacrifice his entire empire for the woman he wronged proves that true love can conquer even the darkest paranoia. If this intense mafia romance kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share the video with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe for more gripping audio stories. See you in the next one.